What is good, everybody? Welcome back to the SB Nation NFL show. I am super excited because there is no better person on the planet to talk to about everything happening with the Miami Dolphins and the Brian Flores lawsuit than the man that I am talking with right now. That is Mike Florio of Pro Football Talk, of Football Night in America. Mike, thanks for the time today.
It's good to be with you, and I'm curious. I don't know where the dividing line is between excited and super excited. Is there vital signs that are checked? Is it a pulse thing,
Yep.
breathing rate? I don't know. What makes someone super excited? I'm just curious about that.
It's a heart rate. I got a little bounce in my step right now. I'm not gonna lie. Look, I don't get the chance to catch up with you that often now that we don't work together anymore. So when you come on, it's a big deal for me.
I would assume that every other day is a big deal because you don't have to deal with me, but that works too.
Well, so like when stuff like this happens, there are days where I'm like, man, I would love to be able to talk with Mike about this because you can break this down for everybody perfectly. You used to practice law, and the best thing that you do is you get through the BS and tell people what's really going on. There are so many tentacles to this story. The first thing I think is like, what happens next procedurally?
Well, with the Brian Flores lawsuit, look, the NFL will have an opportunity to respond. And the first thing the NFL will do, I am confident, is file a motion to dismiss the case, or more specifically, to compel arbitration of it, because all of these coaching contracts contain language that require the coach to bring any grievances, any issues, any complaints, any claims in an arbitration that is ultimately resolved by, drum roll please, the commissioner or his designee. They stack the deck in their favor that way. So that's the first thing the NFL will try to do, is take it out of court and into arbitration. And the problem for the rest of us is that we don't get to learn things the same way that we would if this were a public court proceeding. A lot of things would be protected during the course of litigation, but when it's time to go to trial, you can't close the courtroom over this. Reporters would be allowed to attend, hear the evidence, see the documents, understand what actually is being claimed, how it's being claimed, and how it all happened. So I think the first step in all of this will be a battle over whether or not Brian Flores has an obligation to raise these claims in arbitration, which would unfold without us being able to understand exactly what's happening.
The crazy thing for me is you have all these statements. I only read a couple of pages of the lawsuit that came out, and they have all these statements from Troy Vincent and people in the NFL admitting that something has to change with the hiring practices, that things are not right. All that stuff now can then seemingly be used against the NFL in this case.
The hardest part about handling a case like this, and I handled many of these over the years when I was practicing law, you're never going to get a witness to climb onto the stand and have that Jack Nicholson moment in A Few Good Men when he says, "You're damn right I did." You're never going to get direct evidence of discrimination. And if you ever do have direct evidence of discrimination, the case is going to settle long before it ever gets to trial. The cases that go to trial consist of the management employees who made the decisions about whether or not a person should be fired or not promoted or whatever causes the lawsuit. Those people are always going to say it had nothing to do with any legally protected characteristic, whether it's race, age, gender, national origin, anything protected by state, federal, or local law. They're always going to deny it. And people say, oh, they're going to go in and lie under oath. You don't understand. The lie is told months in advance when they lock in their story. All they're doing is repeating a story they have repeated over and over and over again. They're desensitized to the fact that they're lying about it, and they may actually think it's true. Sometimes it happens at a subconscious level. But when you have words directly from key executives that you can use, and the words from Troy Vincent are along the lines of, there is a double standard for Black coaches. The system is broken. That helps you lay the foundation. And the facts, the bare facts, the hiring facts. I've been saying this all week because when it's time to communicate to a jury, you got to be able to talk to them like we're talking now. You got to have a conversation and have somebody on your front porch or waiting for the bus or hanging around the water cooler at work, if they even have water coolers anymore, if they even have workplaces anymore. But what I would say to a jury is, when you look at the hiring practices of the NFL, the number of Black coaches that have been hired over the last 50 years, You take a coin and you flip it 500 times. And if it comes up heads 490 out of 500 times, there is something wrong with the coin. We don't need to test the metal. We don't need to break it down. We don't need to find exactly what it is that's wrong with the coin. We know there's something wrong with the coin. And Brian Flores, by taking on this lawsuit, is the first one to seize on this evidence that is out there in plain sight. See, I think the NFL never thought they'd have to deal with this because they never thought there would be a coach who was willing to trade his future career or the prospect that he won't have a future career. It's wrong if he's blackballed over this. It would be a separate violation of the law if he's retaliated against and not hired, not considered for future jobs. But still, it's always better to have a job than to be chasing an employer or a group of employers that are bound and determined not to give you that job.
And you have a whole chapter in your book, Playmakers, which if you're watching on the YouTube page, you could see in the background there, comes out March 15th, about the Rooney Rule and how it's not really working. I feel like this story could be a whole other chapter in your book.
Well, Playmakers is based on the last 20 years in the NFL, really up through early 2021. We reopened the book and did a John Gruden chapter in October and sealed it after that. I feel like I could do Playmakers 2 based on everything that's happened in the last 5 months. And did you get a copy of the book yet? Has it arrived?
It's supposed to be on the way, and I'm so looking forward to it.
I was going to give you a hard time for not having it displayed behind you, but you have an excuse. If you don't actually possess a copy of the book, that is an acceptable excuse for not displaying a copy of the book.
It will go up once I get it. Trust me.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out where it's going to go. I'm going to take a picture of this frame, and I'm going to be very curious to see the next time where Playmakers is.
I will have it prominently displayed. I cannot wait to read it. Everybody should go and read it. There are so many good stories. You had the one.
Go and buy it. Go and buy it. I don't care if they read it.
Okay.
I just wanted to buy it.
The little nugget you released about Sean Payton and Anthony Davis and like that just blows me away. And I know there's going to be a ton more stuff in the book, so people should definitely do it. My next question on this case is, do you think it's actually going to get to a trial? Because I thought like with the Colin Kaepernick case, it was like, okay, this is going now. He's not going to back down and we're going to find some stuff out. And then they settled and it all went away. What do you think happens with this?
Remember, the Colin Kaepernick case by rule under the operation of the collective bargaining agreement had to go to arbitration. There was never going to be a trial in open court. That's what I was talking about earlier. Ideally, we want to have access to these proceedings. We want to be able to show up and hear what's said. If Colin Kaepernick had not settled his claims against the NFL, that they colluded against him, that they agreed, that they operated in a way that essentially violates the antitrust laws. You have 32 different businesses coming together and agreeing not to employ someone. That would have played out in a private arbitration. We may have seen the ruling. Maybe somebody would have eventually acquired a copy of the transcript, but we wouldn't have been there to see it unfold. And that's what will happen with Flores if the NFL prevails on this threshold fight to send the case to arbitration. If it doesn't, there'll be a trial if the case doesn't settle or otherwise get thrown out. And what typically happens in a case like this, there's an early effort to throw it out or force arbitration. Then it goes to the discovery process where witnesses are questioned, documents are exchanged. That lasts 9 months to a year, maybe longer if the case is more complicated. And because this case also has a class action component, there's a separate process of getting class certification that either fails or succeeds. And if it fails, Brian Flores still has his case. And there could be other coaches who decide to walk arm in arm with Brian Flores and join the effort. His lawyer yesterday, appearing, I think, on CNN, suggested that other coaches will join up. But at some point, there will be an effort, they call it a motion for summary judgment, where the defendant tries to say there's no need for a trial. Based upon everything we've developed during the discovery process, there's no reason for a jury to be impaneled to decide who said what to whom and when. Even if we accept the evidence that we've developed in the light most favorable to the plaintiff, we win based on application of the law. That happens in 99.999% out of 100 of these cases involving employment discrimination. Once you clear that, then you have your opportunity to go to trial. That's months, if not years down the road. The St. Louis litigation that was settled in November was hanging around for 7 years, I believe.
Wow.
6 or 7 years before it actually was settled. And there's always that specter of settlement. And by the time the NFL gets to the point where it knows it is facing a public trial, especially if it would be a trial in open court that reporters could attend and all this stuff could come out, and you put these witnesses on the stand who are owners, who are not going to be very good witnesses. You parade them in one after another, like the Seinfeld finale. That's when it gets very ugly and nasty for the NFL. That's why I think they settled the St. Louis case. The question is, would Brian Flores, if it goes that long and gets to that point, would he take a settlement, or would he say, I don't want your money, I want your accountability? It's easy to say if you don't have a pile of money sitting on the table. At a certain point, they make you an offer you can't refuse. And that may be what the NFL has to ultimately do with Brian Flores to avoid a public reckoning.
Let's say he doesn't do that. Let's say he decides, I'm not going to take the money. What do you think will come out of this? Because even the list of things that he's asking for, I feel like are very hard to implement and very hard to kind of maintain and oversee.
Well, I think a lot of the stuff he's looking for is really aimed at us. You know, when lawsuits get written and drafted and filed, a lot of the stuff that gets put in there is for the benefit of the media. And when you go to court, there's two different types of relief you can seek. You can seek legal relief, which is a requirement that the defendant write you a check. It's money changing hands. And then there's equitable relief, where you ask the court to find that the other side must do something. You know, my neighbor built a fence that is a foot onto my side of the property, force my neighbor to tear his fence down. That's equitable relief. That is a court order saying someone must do something or someone must refrain from doing something. You know, my neighbor plays his stereo too loud. He's violating a noise ordinance and it's a nuisance for me. Tell him after 10 p.m. he's got to turn off his stereo. That's telling someone what they can't do. So some of these things we'll see. If Brian Flores wins and he proves discrimination, it's up to the judge to decide how far he or she wants to go with an order saying this is what the NFL must do. But those things that Brian Flores is asking for could become the components of a settlement offer. And, you know, it's a lot easier sometimes to do things than to pay someone money. It's a lot cheaper to agree to things that you otherwise maybe should do anyway. So I think that it's way too early to begin to speculate on whether or not there would be a final court order that these things need to be done. But these things become part of the discussion, maybe part of the settlement negotiations, and maybe if there is a resolution without a full-blown trial and further hearings by a court to decide whether or not to mandate those steps, maybe there's an agreement among the parties that those steps will be implemented. Maybe the NFL should just do it anyway. Maybe there's some good stuff in there that the NFL would be wise to do.
Does he have to win in order for real change to happen in the league?
No, I don't think he has to win. I concluded the Rooney Rule chapter in Playmakers by saying, basically, look, the Rooney Rule doesn't work. The Rooney Rule was adopted under the threat of litigation from Cyrus Mary and Johnny Cochran, the O.J. Simpson lawyer. Johnny Cochran is since deceased, but they made the league believe they were going to file a lawsuit on behalf of someone. I don't know who, but someone who was willing to trade his career in 2002 to effect this kind of change. And they were placated by the adoption of a requirement that every head coaching vacancy include at least one minority candidate being interviewed. And here we are 20 years later, and what's it really done? And there's been so many exceptions that teams have taken advantage of. You know, Jerry Jones early on wanted to hire Bill Parcells, so he made a phone call to Dennis Green, a phone call. And the NFL said, well, okay, you know, you got to do face-to-face interviews. And the NFL has chased some of these teams around as they've found ways to exploit loopholes in the rule. But now, and my point was at the end of the Playmakers Rooney Rule chapter, only the credible threat of litigation or actual litigation will get them to change. So they could win this, but they could still come out of it saying, we dodged that bullet. We may not dodge the next one. We'd better change our ways. But this is the more fundamental problem, Stats. And I just wrote something about this before coming down here to do this. And this is something we've been talking about on PFT Live the past couple of days. At the end of the day, these billion-dollar football organizations are owned by oligarchs who treat them like monarchies. And you've got a lot of people who are in these positions of power and influence and extreme wealth who are going to do what they want to do. And even if the league is trying to tell them, you can't do that, you shouldn't do that. If Troy Vincent is saying to them at these meetings, this is a broken system. There is a double standard. You've got to change this. They're still not going to do it. And I think at some point, whether it's the Washington football team toxic workplace and how that was allowed to exist, and there was inadequate human resources, personnel available to field complaints and act on complaints, whether it's the systemic racism we've seen when it comes to the hiring of black head coaches and black general managers, or whether it's this notion that Brian Flores was allegedly offered $100,000 to lose games because the owner wanted the first pick in the draft. How do I get the first pick in the draft? I lose as many games as I can. How do I do it? Well, if my coach isn't going to do it willingly, I'll offer him $100,000 for every game he loses, allegedly. I think that the NFL would be better served in the future if it changes the rules to allow teams to become corporations like the Packers are, but real corporations, not fake certificate that you put on the wall and you can't resell it and it doesn't appreciate in value. I'm talking about a team like the Broncos. Instead of selling the Broncos to the highest bidder who's going to pay $4 billion or more for the team, do an initial public offering of shares of Denver Broncos Incorporated and let the shares be publicly traded. And then with a corporation, you're going to have a board of directors that can be made up of a diverse cross-section of the Denver community. You can have layers and levels of corporate governance with officers and committees. And even though corporations are far from immune from this concept of violating the law, there's real accountability if it happens. You see change. CNN's president, Jeff Zucker, if an owner of an NFL team did what Jeff Zucker did to cause him to walk away, that owner isn't walking away. Unless the other person in the alleged relationship goes public with it.
Right.
It's so much harder to brush things under the rug with the corporation where there's a greater degree of transparency and openness. That may be the way to solve these problems. And the NFL is not going to go easily into that type of an existence. There's a reason why these are all multi-billion-dollar teams owned by the richest of the rich people. That's the way they like it. And that's probably the way they want to keep it.
And really what the NFL is probably going to do, right? They're going to do the thing that looks the best from a PR standpoint that costs the least amount of money.
Or just issue statements like Brian Flores' claims are without merit. That was astounding. Peter King did a great job at noticing that right out of the gates. How in the world can you say that the claims are without merit when you just opened the envelope and read the lawsuit? And then a day later, when this notion that Stephen Ross may have violated the Federal Sports Bribery Act and could be subject to prosecution and imprisonment of up to 5 years, then all of a sudden, well, we're investigating this. Well, I thought you said his claims don't have merit.
Right. You've already decided.
What are you investigating? Do you want to just make sure they don't have merit? Do you want to see how little merit they have? So this is a problem. When Ross issued his statement last night, very strongly worded, it tells me he's cornered, he's feeling wounded, and he's concerned. And when NFL Network went public with a report that there's a witness, Ross owns NFL Network along with the other 31 owners. You know how I feel about that. I was amazed. I wonder whether or not the people at NFL Network did the mental gymnastics and understood that they were jumping on a third rail, or whether they just kind of did it and then realized after the fact, this may be a problem.
And you have been saying for years that as the NFL gets involved with gambling, that if they have any kind of problems, they need to watch out for congressional involvement. And that's something that they want to avoid. And what was it, 2 days after this story broke, we already got news that they want to have hearings?
Well, and it's not just congressional involvement. It's worrying about prosecutorial involvement. There is a broad swath of discretion that prosecutors have. And the easier a case is to prove, the more likely a prosecutor is to take it on. So it's one thing for Brian Flores to say, he offered me $100,000 for each game we lost, and Stephen Ross to say, no, I didn't. When you have a witness, and for now the person is unnamed, but if the crap hits the fan, they'll find out who this person is, and maybe there's more than one person. The more people who are siding with Brian Flores, the easier it is to satisfy that very high bar of proof beyond a reasonable doubt. If it doesn't fit, you must acquit. There's a chance it may fit if you have enough evidence. That's what they also need to be worried about. And with legalized gambling, there are so many different things that I think the NFL is blind to. And the final section of Playmakers focuses on the issues the NFL needs to be concerned about in the future, whether it's people who may be inclined to fix games. And I viewed it from a Tim Donaghy perspective. Fixing games directly because of gambling interests, not fixing games for unrelated reasons, but in a gambling environment, you step into a pile of crap if you do that, beyond the fact that you may violate federal law. But the handling of inside information, who's injured, who's not injured, game plans. You know, I had a coach say to me, what happens if I have on the whiteboard my first 15 plays that are scripted out for this weekend's game, and janitor comes in and sees it and takes a picture of it and sees that 10 of the first 15 plays are going to get the ball in the hands of our running back. And that information gets used on one of these prop bets, right? Or for daily fantasy, where the money is more and more significant all the time. So there's a lot of things that the NFL needs to be concerned about, but they need to have the imagination, the creativity, and the foresight to recognize how this can blow up in their faces.
Last question for me is, apart from the legal side of this, just from a football standpoint, is Stephen Ross like looking at if they can prove this? I mean, he can't own the team, right? We're looking at Ross losing his ownership, possible penalties to the Dolphins. What do you think will happen from just a football standpoint to Miami and the Giants?
If this is proven, if the tanking part of it is proven as it relates to the Dolphins, I think Stephen Ross must sell the team. And he already has one of his minority partners who owns, a percentage of the team. And I think there's a transition plan when Ross is done owning the team, either because he's decided he's done or he's no longer alive. And again, he's in his 80s. So this plan is going to come into fruition at some point. I think he has to tap out. I think he has to walk away. With the Giants and the Broncos, who are also named defendants in this lawsuit, if there is a finding that they engaged in sham interviews, that they put the cart before the horse, that they really weren't serious about Brian Flores, and that becomes further evidence of racial bias, I think there would be penalties. There would be significant sanctions. I don't think we're looking at transfers of ownership over it, but it would be a serious problem for the teams involved and a serious problem for the NFL. I just want to see that they're taking it seriously. When I see a statement that overstates their credentials when it comes to workplace diversity and concludes by saying the claims are without merit, that tells me not that they're taking it seriously. That tells me that they're circling the wagons and they're getting ready to fight. And that's what Brian Flores has to be ready for. I always told my potential clients when it was time to decide whether or not to go forward, ask yourself two questions. One, what's the worst thing about yourself that you don't want other people to find out about? Two, assume other people are going to find out about it, and are you comfortable with that happening? And if the answer to number two is no, then we can't go forward. So Flores has to be ready for them to delve into every nook and cranny of his life under the guise that this is legitimate discovery efforts, just to make it unpalatable, embarrassing, and ultimately soften him up to either walk away or take whatever they put on the table.
See, this is why everybody needs to go out, buy Playmakers. You get the explanation for the who, the how, and how the sausage gets made, basically. Mike, thank you very much for the time. I appreciate the breakdown, and hopefully we talk again soon.
All right, thanks, Stats. Good talking to you, pal.